And once again, my name is Dee Barasa, and it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce and welcome today's speaker, Dr. Ann Helmrich. Dr. Helmrich is Associate Director of the Getty Foundation and former Associate Director of Digital Initiatives at the Getty Research Institute. Both institutes are part of the J. Paul Getty Trust, the world's largest cultural and philanthropic organization dedicated to the visual arts. And before her most recent appointment at the Getty, she was Dean of the College of Fine Arts at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. She's a scholar of 19th century art, and Dr. Helmrich explored the relationship between art and science in her most recent book, Nature's Truth: Photography, Painting, and Science in Victorian Britain. Her current research focuses on the history of the art market and the productive intersection of the digital humanities and art history. Wait till you see this. She recently co-authored the epilogue to Art Crossing Borders, the birth of an integrated art market in the age of nation states. In 2019, she co-edited a special issue of Visual Resources dedicated to digital art history. A student of Anne's told me that she is not only a great scholar, but is known for her encouragement of young scholars and her warmth and kindness. And she's also exhibited wise decision-making skills, because after a bit of time in Fort Worth, Texas, she returned to the Getty and the Golden State of California. And we are all beneficiaries of her return. So who was M. Knoedler, and what was happening in the US and European art markets in the mid-1800s? And what is digital art history? Hang on, all will be revealed in this thought-provoking lecture by our guest speaker, Dr. Ann Helmrich. Dr. Helmrich, welcome.
Thank you, thank you. And I want to thank the team. You know, it's some days, if you're a guest lecturer, you feel like you show up at the door of some place and you're like knocking around, where do I go? And that has been the opposite experience I've had. Everyone's been so gracious and wanting to make sure everything goes so smoothly. So if anything goes badly, it's all on me because the team has been superb.
Yeah.
So I think my next step is to share my screen. And how is that looking for everybody? Great.
Fine.
Good, good. So thank you again for inviting me. And it's such a treat to be able to, I'm sorry I'm not with you, but share this with you, this talk. And it's such a treat to be able to share my passions with you. So with this talk today, let's see, I have to figure out how to, yes. With the talk today, I want to do a couple of things. I want to introduce you to the art dealers Knoedler, who are one of the longest running art dealers in the US. Now, they came to a rather sad end. I'm not going to talk about that bit. I'm going to focus on how they came to be, so the early years of Knoedler. I also want to share with you a little bit about the resources at the Getty Research Institute, and I understand some of you may have already used those in the past. I just learned that some of them were used for the Bouguereau show. But just to let you know, things that are available to you online or in person. And then I also want to talk to you today a little bit about the concept of provenance, which I think, as you as docents know, is so critical for helping us understand the stories behind the objects we hold in museums. So provenance as the history of ownership of an object. So let me start by situating Knoedler. Knoedler as an art dealer dates back to the 1840s. And they were one of the few art dealers in New York at that time. And in fact, the concept of an art dealer didn't really exist in the 1840s. people sold art in relationship to other sort of bric-a-brac. And in fact, we know a number of people sold art and also sold mirrors, which suggests that frames were maybe the more common element between them. So in the 1840s, very few what we might think of as art dealers. After the Civil War in New York City, the art market begins to boom. And as you can see, I've given you its title page from a city directory on the left. By 1883, the category of art dealer exists in the city directory. That is, you can look up in the equivalent of, well, it wasn't a telephone book back then, but a directory of businesses and find the category of art dealer. And there were over 40 in 1883. And by the end of World War I, there were over 200 art dealers listed. So the art market really booms in that second half of the 19th century. And we can really think about the infrastructure of commercial art dealers beginning to develop and have distinct identities at that moment. So this is the stage in which Knoedler is operating. They begin in Broadway, Lower Broadway. This is a view of the shop, and this is a panorama of Broadway, and you can see here is their business here. And in a building that's just chock-a-block, so you could buy a piano, you could buy some art, you could buy all these things at once. And they were crowded amongst other retail establishments. So how do they go from one of these crowded retail establishments to this standalone, purpose-built, beautifully executed art gallery that almost like a small museum? So that's sort of the arc I want to share with you today, how they go from that retail shop to a quasi almost museum-like environment in this townhouse. And I want to sort of help understand why by 1938, when this article was published on the middlemen of art, this appeared in Vogue magazine, so how is it that Knoedler comes to be one of the dealers that's featured in 1938? So I'm going to go back a slide and I'm going to read to you a quote from this 1938 Vogue article describing Knoedler in that time period. So sorry, this is the next building they occupy in 1926. So I'm going to read to you from this Vogue article describing this gallery that was built in 1926. The solid, handsome building which houses the Knoedler galleries is imposing, affluent, a gallery to understand and enjoy. Throughout its history, it's been famous for conservatism, a business-like approach to art, scrupulous honesty in matters of authenticity, and great fairness in striking a bargain. Building collections, great collections, is the chief work of this gallery, which helped to build those of Henry Clay Frick, Mrs. Jack Gardner, which is the Gardner Museum today, Andrew Mellon, whose collections in the National Gallery, and P.A.B. Widener, whose collections are in the National Gallery as well. So that's the story I want to share, how they went from that crowded retail shop to this imposing affluent gallery known for building the famous art collections of America. I'm also indirectly sharing with you a research project that we've been embarked on at the Getty Research Institute that's looking at how the art market moved from centered in Europe, primarily the Western art market centered in Europe, to becoming recentered in the US, particularly in New York. And we're very interested in the roles of dealers, collectors, and museums in that change of the focus of the art market. My talk today is organized into 7 short chapters that will outline the gallery's history up till the 1920s. And then I want to turn in the end to 2 works of art that are found in your own collections that pass through the Knoedler Gallery that will help, I'm hoping, bringing some of the information you've heard from those 7 short chapters to those works of art that you may be familiar with. So let's start. Chapter 1 is the early years when they begin in the late 1840s up until 1859, when they occupied 2 different locations over time on Lower Broadway. which was the business district of New York at the time. So as I mentioned, the firm began in the late 1840s. It was actually at the time known as Goupil, and you can see it here. It wasn't named Knoedler yet, it was named Goupil. And it started as a branch, the American branch of a business that was based in Paris. In the 1840s, the Goupil business in Paris was best known for selling prints. And they had devised a very interesting business model whereby they would acquire the paintings of leading artists of the day and then make reproductive prints after those paintings. Then they would go on to sell both the painting and the prints after the painting. But cleverly, they kept the copyright. So no one else could ever sell prints after that painting. They had a lock on the business of selling those prints after the painting. So they took that business model and brought it to New York. So when they opened here amongst these other shops on Broadway, they were primarily a print seller. They also sold illustrated books and artist supplies. So really, maybe closer to a stationery store we might think of today than a fine art dealer. They were managed by a fellow named William Schaus, and that name Schaus, S-C-H-A-U-S, you might see later because he goes on to open his own gallery, and he becomes really a competitor to these folks. Now we have to remember, by the time Goupil decides to open a branch in New York City was the largest city in the nation, right? Earlier it had been Philadelphia and other places, but by the 1820s, New York emerges as the largest city in the United States. It had a population of roughly around 150,000 at this time. And let me read to you a quote that describes what Broadway was like at this moment. And particularly a story from a newspaper about print sellers, people opening businesses to sell prints. Quote, if the taste of the general community of artworks remains ungratified through inspection of old masters, saying, look, there's not too many old masters available in the US. On Broadway, habitual loungers, so people looking for leisure, habitual loungers have ample opportunities for viewing a constant succession of choice engravings. The arrival of each London ship replenishes the windows of our leading print dealers and publishers with specimens from the pens of transatlantic artists. So the idea is, here's New York, this big shipping port, all these prints are coming over from Europe and they're being pasted up in the windows of these shops to entice people to come in and buy them to take them home. So they start the business in the late 1840s. We know by around 1853 or 1854, around the time this print was made, they had renovated the premises. So we know they had a wholesale store at this time for the prints and artist supplies. And by then they had opened a space on the second floor for showing paintings. So they're already starting by the 1850s to move from just prints to including paintings. So I want to talk a little bit about what that business model became by the 1850s. I'm showing you in the upper left an advertisement from the New York Times. So here's that firm, Goupil and Company, which will eventually become Knoedler. And they're telling the readers of the newspaper, we have a wonderful painting on view to which you're invited to our shop at 366 Broadway. And here's the painting. And here's the print after the painting. So the idea is you come to see the painting and you leave with the souvenir of a print. So that was their business model of enticing people to come see a work of art and leave with a souvenir after it. They by and large focus on what they called contemporary art or art of the day. These were artists who were often featured in the European salons, particularly in the French annual salon of painting or the London Royal Academy salons. So these were the artists who were sort of the leading lights of the day in Western Europe. They occasionally did show, old masters. Here's an advertisement showing that they were going to display Murillo's celebrated painting of the Holy Family. And again, they're not actually trying to sell the painting. They're charging you to come. It's 25 cents a head, which, by the way, was the same amount if you wanted to go to Barnum and Bailey Circus or the Barnum Miniatures Show. So, and then here is another clue: call Goupil and Company, but Michael Knoedler runs the business, and he will eventually take it over, and his name becomes affiliated with it. So you can see that here. So again, the business model is really getting people to come in the door like an entertainment spectacle. And here's another example, of a painting. Again, they're noticing that the painting is going to be on display. And look what they tell the viewers. It's 15 by 11 feet. They are really selling the spectacle of this painting. They're telling you that it's 25 cents to come in, who's the shop owner if you need to ask any questions, and they even tell you how to come in, that they've made a new entrance so that you can come through the staircase right up to the second floor where the painting gallery was held. And again, here's the painting that they would have had on display of the royal family that is now in the national collections in France. Now, my colleague Agnès has done some of this digital work, and I want to appreciate and thank her. And what she's showing you in this chart is the number of artworks that are traveling from the Paris branch, which is calling Goupil, to the New York branch, which is calling Knoedler, over this time period. And you can see that there is a huge spike in the numbers in that post-Civil War period. So we know following the Civil War that the firm really still relies on Europe as a source of paintings, but then it changes, and you'll see that as I tell my story, as Knoedler will become more and more interested in American artists and not always be solely importing the works of art. So chapter 2, 1859 to 1869, and they moved to 772 Broadway, and it's called Stewart's Block. So here's a photograph of Goupil. This is their new store that they opened in 1859. So now they are a multi-storied business. And this big building next to them is the first department store that had opened in New York City. So in 1859, Goupil moved to 772 Broadway at the corner of 9th Street, at the northernmost end of Broadway's pre-war retail district. The location was referred to as Stewart's Block because that Mr. Stewart was the majority owner of that block. And he built this department store and had actually hoped the department store could exist over the entire block, but had to wait till Goupil's 10-year lease on their building ended before he could knock it down and finish extending his department store. Now, Stewart's department store heralded a new age of shopping in New York. It was vast in scale, as you see on the outside, and had ornate architecture on the inside. It had a central 48 by 80 foot gallery with cast iron Corinthian columns that allowed it for arcaded display, so natural light could pour down into the displays below. It was particularly welcoming to women shoppers, and really shopping here became a form of commercialized leisure. In addition to innovating shopping through the lavish interior, he used set pricing. You didn't have to haggle anymore. You didn't negotiate. And you could browse without being attended to by a shop assistant. So you could touch things on your own. You didn't go to the counter and ask for things and then have to haggle for the price. So a lot of shoppers said they felt this is a much more enjoyable experience around shopping. Now, why is this story important to Knoedler? Well, Knoedler is, to Goupil's, or run by Knoedler, it's right next door to the department store. And the department store reportedly attracted over 10,000 customers a day. So would that have benefited the store right next door? And in fact, I'm showing you on the right an illustration of people crowded around the windows of Goupil, using it as almost like a street museum, looking at the prints displayed in the windows. Chapter 3. In 1869, at 772 Broadway, the firm moved again. At the same time, when their lease ended, they became an independent business, buying themselves out from the Paris branch and beginning to take on the name of Knoedler. And you can probably only barely make that out, but it says Knoedler and Company. So by 1869, Michael Knoedler, who'd been running the shop all these years, buys them out and says, I am now the owner. My name goes on this business. But sometimes informally, it was still known as Goupil. So you'll see the name Knoedler and Goupil go back and forth in this time period. So they moved to 170 Fifth Avenue near the corner of 22nd Street into a 4-story brownstone, a former residence that they converted into a shop. Now, by this time, New York City's population had increased nearly 8-fold from 150,000 in 1825 to 942,000 in 1869. And the ranks of the middle and upper classes had grown considerably, buoyed by the wealth generated by the city's transportation industry, the growing manufacturing sector, and the rapidly expanding banking and financial services sectors, which enjoyed a post-war boom. And moreover, New York City had begun to really develop a kind of society culture with a social season, including the opera, gentlemen's clubs, and literary societies that helped to reinforce social, political, and economic networks. Knoedler was located in the midst of the retail district, serving what was called then the carriage trade. And this is a 10 blocks south of the palatial residences being erected by the richest families, some of them new money, such as the Astors, and I'm showing you the Astors house here. One of the first luxury retailers to move to this area was Tiffany's, which I'm showing you on the left, which erected a purpose-built structure at Union Square. And in the next year, Brentano's bookstore and Decker's piano store jointly erected this building you see on the right. So this is the neighborhood to which Knoedler joins in a kind of luxury retail near the wealthy. God bless you.
Oh, sorry.
What did the gallery look like? As you see here, it had display windows with those prints still visible from the street, so folks could come by and have a museum experience on the street. Inside, it was not the white cube we think of today. In the lower right, I'm showing you a stereoscope, right? You would put it in that device, it would look 3D. And this shows the display area for prints. And you can see they're all stacked up on shelves and it could be easily exchanged out. And then here's the painting display area in this illustration. And again, if you look on the walls, paintings are hung very close together. This is very typical of the 19th century salon hanging. And I also find this illustration wonderful in that it seems to me that the people are spending just as much time looking at each other as they are at the painting. So this is clearly the idea of an art gallery as a social space as well. We know that in 1876, Knoedler added an extension on the ground floor of this building. And we know that they added selling watercolors by creating a special watercolor room on the second floor, because you know watercolors are light sensitive. In the downstairs display rooms, the New York Times enthusiastically reported, the pictures can be seen to the same advantage and with the same effects of light as in a private drawing room. The reporter continued, the suite has been decorated and furnished handsomely without any brilliant hangings to interfere with colors of the paintings. And here are examples of works that we know passed through Knoedler's hands at this time. Daubigny painting, a Corot, Delarote, and again, very much art of the time. This is really what Knoedler specialized at the time. And this kind of combination of Barbizon or contemporary salon painters displayed in what may have looked like a private drawing room really helped the dealer appeal to those pursuing what was called at the time the artistic interior. And this was something that was really put forward by interior decorating magazines and publications such as this one, Artistic Houses. And I'm showing you the library of William Vanderbilt and his picture gallery. And again, you can see sort of the taste for display and hanging that was typical of the time. Now, if you remember, Knoedler started as a branch of the Goupil firm in Paris. Then Michael Knoedler buys himself out, sets himself up as an independent business, and does very, very well. So well that by the 1880s, the Paris house says, oops, maybe we shouldn't have sold out to Knoedler. We want to go open our new branch once again in New York. So they, as you see in this new newspaper advertisement, open their own branch in New York and try to compete with Knoedler, selling the same kinds of art, contemporary French paintings, such as Bouguereau's Return of Spring that we know they handled. They tried the same selling strategy of making the interior of the gallery look like a wonderful home interior. And what they also said is they would sell the art at absolutely fixed prices. They would not negotiate or haggle. But this seems to have backfired on them, this strategy. The business didn't go so well, and Knoedler sued them, saying, no, we get to be the ones who say we are the successors of Goupil in New York. You don't get to come and say that. And so the Paris branch lost the lawsuit and had to withdraw from New York. But that really meant that Knoedler then really was cleared the way for them to still have this ties back to Paris, but not be so dependent on Paris. So chapter 4, 1896 to 1912. By 1896 in New York, the journal The Collector observed places selling art had sprung up all over the city. Quote, you come upon them everywhere, far downtown, along the waterside, upon the outskirts, and even in the heart of this great mart. This observation was followed by a story of a Frenchman peddling a forged Raphael. So what this article points to was the pressure for art dealers to achieve distinction because there was more competition, and they needed to make sure they had a reputation for honesty and verifiable expertise because of all these concerns about forgeries. Keep that in mind as I tell the next chapter in Knoedler's history. In 1896, they moved again to 355 Fifth Avenue at the northeast corner of 34th Street. This was an area that had been largely developed as residential in the 1880s with townhouses of the wealthy. So again, really putting themselves cheek to jowl with the very people who would buy art from them. You can also see as the advertisement on the right, they begin to move into the old master market as well as modern paintings. So, and again, see how they're positioning themselves as successors of Goupil and Company, but establishing their own identity. The Pittsburgh Post in 1910 ran an extensive story about the crowds flocking to the galleries around 34th Street, where Knoedler had just moved, explaining to readers that, quote, just as the names of popular theaters are household words to thousands of Manhattanites, so are in other homes, the programs advertised are kept close track of for art dealers such as Knoedler, Durand-Ruel, Schaus, Macbeth, Scott and Falls, the Madison, Montrose, and others. Saturday, the paper explained further, was matinee day, when matinee types of the fashionable classes regularly visited the art galleries. At Knoedler, they promised you would see many women discussing the merits of portrait painters with a view to future cities. And the matinee girl that you see represented in the illustrations of this article was a social phenomenon of the period. As well-educated middle-class women began to explore respectable social entertainments in public spaces without escorts. And the art gallery was clearly one of those spaces they could safely travel in. In 1899, the Knoedler firm invested considerably in renovating their building. They put new stonework around the front door. So they added these columns and this portico over the door. And they said they hoped that this would prove to be the finest and most dignified entrance of any picture store in New York. And they put a new cornice, a new cornice around their picture window here. Inside, they installed an elevator and reorganized the internal spaces. And they said that they wanted to reorganize so the staff would have ready access to stock for customers who expected quick service. And they also improved the private gallery on the second floor. So they wanted people to be able to walk off the street, buy something quickly, or take the elevator up to the second floor where they could look with more quiet and more time. The artist William Homer recognized the viewing platform created by the redesigned shop windows. And by this time, Knoedler is representing William Winslow Homer, and he wrote to the dealer concerning his painting, The Early Morning, that I'm showing you here. And he said, really, this painting can properly be seen by the opposite side of the street. Stand at the street corner and look at it from 60 feet away. That is the best rule of thumb for this painting. And he goes on to illustrate in the letter, and I've shown you that here, where if people look too closely, they're not really seeing the painting. So I find it very interesting that Homer is thinking about the shop window at some distance as the best way to see his paintings. Now, at this time, Knoedler grew even more ambitious. As you can see, they renovated their premises, they bring on more artists that they represent, and they begin to have their own branches. They opened one in Pittsburgh for 5 years in 1897, and I think primarily because they were courting Henry Clay Frick as a customer. So let's not wait for Frick to come to New York. Let's take Knoedler to Pittsburgh. In the 1890s, they began to explore establishing a branch in Paris. And I'm showing you here a map that outlays, they moved several times after they decided to open the branch in Paris. And this is a map by my colleague, Leah Saint-Raymond, who's been mapping all the galleries and dealers in New York digitally. So Pittsburgh, Paris, then they set their sights on London. And there in London, they fostered a relationship with the art dealer Lowry and Company that was located on Old Bond Street. And in 1901, Lowry and Company had decided that they would move and agreed to give their existing building or sell it to Knoedler. And this was very astute because it meant Knoedler could really benefit from the reputation of the Lowry firm by simply taking over the building and building on their relationship of networks. And this became very important for what Knoedler begins to do more and more, which is move into the old master market. They really need those ties in Paris and London to serve customers like Frick who want old masters. So you can see that this network of branches is a way for them to move works from Europe to their buyers in the US. And let me show you some examples of paintings they helped to acquire and sell on. So this Velázquez from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm showing you the provenance chain. It goes to Lowry and Company and then to Knoedler, and then Knoedler sells it to the MFA. So London to New York to Boston. Or this Van Dyck that's now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC. It was sold on in Paris, then to London, to Kolnagi, then to Knoedler, who then sells it to Widener, and Widener gives it to the National Gallery of Art. So you can see that whole network operates to bring that object from Europe to the United States. Kolnagi is also interested. They're another London dealer, and Knoedler and Kolnagi often went in together to buy a painting and sell it on, what they call joint ownership, and then they would split the profits. They did that in the case of this painting bought by Henry Clay Frick, sourced in London, and then you can see Kolnagi and Knoedler buy it together and sell it to Frick. This brings me to the next chapter of Knoedler's history, 1912 to 1926. So here they are, they've been building up this reputation, they've been building up this network, and they decide we need a new building. And we are no longer just gonna lease old houses and turn them into shops. We're gonna build a purpose-built art gallery. They buy the lot owned by the Lotus Club, which was a social club in New York, tear down the building and build this. So this is the first purpose-built, architecturally designed gallery that the Knoedler firm owns. They move uptown to 556, 558 Fifth Avenue. Remember, by now Central Park has been built out. So this is now a very desirable neighborhood. And it's described as highly fashionable. They hire the architects John Carrier and Thomas Hastings to do the building in the Beaux-Arts style. And inside, you would have walked into a reception hall. And then on the ground floor, there were 3 major galleries. On the upper floor, there were galleries as well. They ordered the furniture for the galleries from London, deciding that it must be very English in taste. They looked in particular at the furniture at Devonshire House in London in the style of William Kent, which they thought would be very well suited to portraits by Van Dyck that they were trying to sell at the time. In fact, when they sent the furniture over from London, the accompanying letter explained, "I think it will look stunning and give people a good idea of a Georgian dining room and is particularly suitable for English portraits." So this new space allowed Knoedler to refine and develop new selling strategies of masterpiece old masters, along with continuing to serve the matinee crowd. The architecture referred to palatial townhouses and English country houses. It was a strategy aimed at the elites as well as the middle classes. In 1926, they moved again to East 57th Street, again in a palatial townhouse they had built just for them, and this is where they remained for many decades. So I want to turn now to their impact on collecting. I've already touched on several paintings that entered museum collections through Knoedler. Now, this was at a time when many American museums were being criticized by European experts for lacking high quality art, but Knoedler helped to address this. So let me show you further examples. They donated a set of Goya prints to the Metropolitan Museum of Art when it was beginning its prints and drawing study room under the directorship of Paul Sachs. The Morgan Library and Museum that was opening acquired this Rembrandt from Knoedler. So they were still continuing to specialize in prints, but now old master prints. They sold American paintings, including this work that was sold to the Cleveland Museum of Art by Gilbert Stuart. Now, these are examples of works that went directly from Knoedler to the museums, but sometimes their role was more indirect. Here's a painting that is now in the Getty, and you can see Knoedler handled it between 1908 and 1911, but it passed through many different hands before it came to the Getty. So sometimes Knoedler's role was more indirect rather than direct. To understand what Knoedler's role is, we've been going through the stock books that have been digitized and entered into a database, looking at all the people who bought paintings from Knoedler and trying to understand which of those eventually made their way to museums. When we look at those collectors, it's very interesting to note. Of course, you would expect a New York business would attract many collectors in the East Coast, and they're so dense, we can't hit the labels for the cities overlap. But we can begin to see that they actually sold out into the Midwest and even as far as the West Coast, which really brings me to our story of San Diego. So these are names of collectors in the cities that bought from Knoedler and eventually give their paintings to museums. So the San Diego Museum of Art. So I'm going to show two examples from your collections that went through the hands of Knoedler. On the left, Carlo Crivelli, Madonna and Child, and on the right, the George Inness. And these are wonderful examples because they really show the multiple dimensions of Knoedler's business, old masters on the one hand, and American art of their time on the right. So here's the provenance chain for your Crivelli, and here is Knoedler. But look at the story behind this. Here's that name Kolnagi again, paired up with Knoedler before they sold it to the Thornton Realty Company, who eventually became part of the chain that brought it to San Diego. Remember, we saw Kolnagi and Knoedler teaming up to sell a painting to Frick in 1914 in this Jakob Maris, the bridge. So we know that they partnered together quite frequently. If I go to the Getty Provenance Index, to the digitized database, here's more information about the sale of this painting. Knoedler bought the painting and they had a share, half of it with Kolnagi, and then they sold it, as we know. So they bought it and sold it to the Thornton Realty Company. And I thought you might be interested to know, they sold it for $85,000. What would that be worth today? It would be over $1 million in today's dollars. So that Thornton Realty Company had some deep pockets to be able to acquire that work of art, which eventually made its way to you. So that's in 1926, $85,000 would be worth over 100 million in today's dollars. Turning to the Innes painting, Knoedler had really helped to create a market for American painters. At the end of the 19th century, when Innes was working, he really complained a number of times, we're getting shut out of the market by European artists. And Knoedler really helped to promote American artists. Now, here is the provenance chain for this painting. It goes from Innes to a fellow named George Seney, who was one of the most important art collectors in America at the time. He made his money from the railroads and banking, and he went boom and bust so many times. And he frankly used his art collection as a way to get easy cash. So when his businesses went bust, he would sell his art collection. Then when he was doing well, he'd build up his collection again. And the American Art Galleries was actually an auction house. So this is telling you in 1894, he had to auction it off. It got bought by Widener in Philadelphia. And then from Widener, it got bought by Knoedler. From Knoedler, it went to this fellow in Colorado Springs. And we saw in that map earlier that Knoedler was able to attract buyers in the West. From Bosworth, it went to Everett, and from Everett to you all. So here is Seney on the left, and here is that auction sale where that painting had to be put up for sale because Seney was bankrupt. Now, that sale was one of the most famous sales in American art at the time. Here's another painting that was sold at that sale that's now in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So this was the cream of the crop in terms of American paintings that were purchased from the Seney sale. So again, it goes from Seney to the auction house, then is bought by Widener, and from Widener, Knoedler acquires it. So here is a photograph of Widener in his home, Linwood Hall, which you can see he built his own private art gallery in his home outside of Philadelphia. And now let's turn to the story in the Knoedler, in the Getty Provenance Index. You can see Knoedler buys it from Widener in 1905, January, sells it at the end of the month. So pretty quick turnaround, bought it for $500 and sells it for $1,500. So not a bad turnaround in a few weeks' time. $1,500 at the time, 1905, in today's dollars would be a little over $46,000. So value, but not nearly the value of an old master painting. So you can see American artists still had a ways to go. And as you know, from Bosworth, it came to the West Coast, and then from there to your museum. So again, finishing out the provenance chain, it comes to you. And which is how a painting of a Nantucket sunset came to reside in San Diego. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was fascinating. And I'm sorry for sneezing in the middle of your presentation. So I think, first of all, the your presentation and the engravings were just incredible. And I was wondering if you have any information on who made many of those engravings.
It's a great, great question. We do. Many of the prints that Goupil made after paintings, when you look at the lower ledger, you can see those. There's information on the prints themselves. Also, if the prints were ever sold in England in the 19th century, England had much stricter copyrights than the US had very loose copyright in the 19th century. Some of you may know the story of Charles Dickens being absolutely furious because his books were being knocked off in the US and sold, so he wasn't making any money off of them. So we were not great on the copyright side, but London, the UK, had very, very tight copyright. So those prints got registered there. And you can go through the list of prints that are registered there. And the last place you can find them, there's a wonderful, wonderful museum in the south of France. And it's a funny story. So Goupil in Paris, that was making many of these prints, they don't survive World War I. They go out of business. But a man bought all the prints. They bought the paper prints and the plates the prints were bought off, thinking, I'm going to make a business. I'm going to sell these again. Never gets it going. Never gets it going. He retires to the south of France, leaves everything to his son. His son, gets all this stuff, is like, what am I ever going to do with this project my father never did anything with? So he gave it to the local history museum. So they have up in their attic, stored all away, copies of almost every single print that Goupil ever made or sold, as well as many of the plates. So you can find those there. Then those prints and engravings around New York City, we've been finding those through colleagues like at the New York Public Library or the Museum of the City of New York. So we've been really fortunate that we've just put out the feelers to colleagues in the field and say, tell us if you find any old photographs or engravings of Knoedler or Goupil. And so we've been kind of building up a little database of those.
Wow, okay. And you pointed out the difference in cost between the Innis and the Crivelli. What explains the change in prices on
Yeah, it's a really good question because the notion of value is complicated, right? It's not just dollars. So one of the things that Knoedler was, I think, very strategic about is they realized, you can enhance the value of something by your display, right? If I put it in a wonderful exhibition, if I write a catalog about it, if I get experts to write about it. So they definitely invested a lot of that in the old masters. And they even created what they called pedigrees. So in the files of the Getty Research Institute, you can find these beautiful, cursive copperplate handwriting where they would list all the provenance, what was known about the painting. And they tended to do that for the old masters, but not for the American artists who were living. I think they thought, well, these people are living. What do we need to write down? And so and they created a kind of reputation for the old masters that they didn't quite do for the Americans, because I think they just didn't feel it was quite as necessary. So then when somebody like Innis passes away, all of a sudden there's none of that information available. So it takes a while. It's not till the 1960s that the market in American paintings really begins to rebound from that, from a kind of downfall at the beginning of the 20th century when they were kind of competing against the old masters.
Okay.
So I see some questions in chat. Should I lift up some of those?
I can do that for you.
Thank you.
Yes. So did Knoedler deal in other forms of art like sculpture or photography?
Yeah, it's a good question. That definitely you can find examples of that in their sales catalogs, but that wasn't their primary focus. They were really paintings and prints. So minor numbers of sculpture, and they never really pushed heavily into the photography market. And again, photography doesn't really develop a secondary market with dealers until the 1960s. And I think by then, Knoedler was so established in their sort of neck of the woods, so to speak, that they decided really not to pursue photography. But it's interesting why they never did painting. And I think, sculpture. And I think it's because they came out of prints and that was sort of in their DNA, and the three-dimensional just wasn't where they had expertise.
So Maggie Crowell has a question. Let's get to Maggie.
In that situation where people spent 25 cents to come in and look at the big picture and then hopefully buy a poster, how much was the poster? If the entrance fee was 25 cents, how much was the print that you hoped that they would buy?
Yeah, it's a good question. They would be somewhere like usually between like $5 to $10. So it was a kind of step up, right? And I suspect that there were plenty of people who paid their 25 cents and didn't leave, didn't buy something, but I think at the same time, $5 to $10, it was an investment, but wasn't it was still within the price of middle class leisure, right? And so I think, a book would have cost you maybe 75 cents or $1. So it's like the equivalent of 5 books or something. So I think, it was realizable. And we know that people sometimes bought them and in their parlors had portfolios. So they would kind of leaf them in these giant books. And then one of the entertainments was you would go to someone's home and you would leaf through their print collection and you would have these kind of educated conversations about them. So, remember, they don't have Netflix back then. So.
Okay, thank you.
So do you know how many paintings the Putnam sisters bought through Knoedler?
No, I don't. But whoever has that question, Phyllis, if you go to the Getty Provenance Index, which you can get from the Getty website, you can put into the search box the name of an owner. So you could put Putnam in the search box and it will tell you how many paintings Knoedler sold to Putnam. So I say do the search and see what you turn up.
Thank you.
Which brings us to the question of who can use this digital research?
Yes, so the Getty has made a real commitment to making our resources as much as we can free and open to the public. So the Getty Provenance Index is freely accessible, and we've actually just remodeled it to make the searching even more effective. So if you want to, when you go onto the website, you'll see there's some check boxes. So if you want to say, I want to search across every resource we've digitized for the Provenance Index, you can do that. Or you can say, I only want to look at Knoedler and just check only that box. So that's really helpful if you really want to do a more focused search.
And Jim, did you want to add something?
Sorry, I dropped out. I provided some of the information for Anne where she selected the 2 works of SDMA that she talked about. And as I recall, I don't think the Putnams bought anything directly from Knoedler. They tended to deal with a guy named Jacob Hyman, who was a dealer in New York. And we have from the Putnams, I don't know, 4 or 5 paintings that had been through Knoedler, but they weren't bought directly by Knoedler. There might be maybe 1 or 2 that came from Knoedler. There was a thing in the 39 World's Fair in New York? I think it ran from 39 to 40. The Putnam sisters actually went to New York and attended that World's Fair. And there was this art exhibition there, and all the galleries supplied paintings, but they were all for sale. So in other words, it was a very self-serving kind of art exhibit. And that was where they bought our Henrietta Maria by Van Dyck, which did have an interesting, that did go through Knoedler. And there's a weird story about that. I don't want to dominate this conversation, but real quickly, the man, Ernst Rosenfeld, who bought that painting, these dealers sold on credit, which is really quite amazing. So a lot of these boom and bust kind of investor guys, like you were talking about, Ernst Rosenfeld was one of them, and he lost everything in the stock market crash in 29. But he had this huge collection of art that was all bought on credit. So we found at the Getty in their correspondence files and so on in provenance, these dunning letters where they were very polite. But Duveen's, for instance, he bought a lot from Duveen's, including our Henrietta Maria by Van Dyck. And they kept saying, could you pay a little bit on your account? You owe us, $1,800,000 and you haven't paid us for 6 months and blah, blah, blah. Well, ultimately the man committed suicide because he owed so much money. And because the dealers wouldn't take the paintings back, because what good were they in the Depression? And so his wife eventually, after she inherited everything, sold our Henrietta Maria to Knoedler's, and then it came on down to SDMA. So there's this fascinating chain of provenance that you can look almost any painting in any collection, you can follow these stories back. So I hope that helps a little answer that question.
Thank you.
Also, I want to point out to everyone that Anne has posted the link to the Getty Provenance Index on our chat. And I would also, here's an interesting question. When did Knoedler begin to diversify their holdings with Latin American artists like Rufino Tamayo?
Yeah, so that doesn't happen until later in the 20th century, and they tend to not be sort of the leaders in that. Other dealers like Julian Levy in the 1930s begin to deal with Latin American art really by selling the surrealists. So I think by the second half of the 20th century, Knoedler isn't at the forefront of trends. They're sort of following trends, but they're sort of solid blue chip, if you will, until somebody put in the chat what happened to Knoedler. They were doing.
I was saving that for last.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Unscrupulous, unauthenticated works by the end. So that is not a good business strategy for a dealer.
So it's very interesting that these galleries ended up being a safe place for single women to socialize in. Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, exactly. I was fascinated because I hadn't been aware of that till I did the research. And I sort of hadn't thought about all of this before, I realized, but one of the things Storts did, and I'm sorry, this is a public lecture, but I hope it's okay to mention this, that they had restrooms for women. So, I mean, if you imagine what it meant to go, out for the day and not have any public restrooms, and you're wearing those skirts with big crinolines and things. So to have a place with an attendant and, so that meant you could, go and stay someplace longer. And then also the art galleries, you went in, I didn't mention this, but we know that there were attendants. So you went in through the front door and there was an attendant who greeted you, and an attendant would take you up the elevator. So I think that sense that it was a space that was beautifully appointed, because it was a gallery and they need basically the equivalent of security today, there would be an attendant who would make sure people behaved properly too, right? So nothing got damaged. So that created a safe space for women as well. So exactly, but it wasn't a story I was expecting to find until I started, reading accounts and looking at the images of what it meant to visit a gallery then.
Fascinating. What was the relationship between B. Berenson and Knoedler?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Berenson had closer ties to Duveen, who was really Knoedler's competition in the old master market. And definitely Knoedler used Berenson sometimes to write these pedigrees, and Berenson was paid for the work, but they did not make the relationship to Berenson as public, if you will, as Duveen did. I think, people like Gardner knew that Duveen and Berenson worked together. I don't think some of the people, they might have asked Knoedler, but I think because they came with these written pedigrees, they weren't relying so much on, say, a verbal, but we know in other cases for other dealers, they would ask an expert, go, but because Knoedler created these written pedigrees, that became a sort of arm's length way of verifying the paintings.
And is that where the problems developed, or towards the end?
Not so much. They were misrepresenting the paintings in the end. So and misrepresenting experts. So so that reputation they had built up over the years was, decimated in a short amount of time.
Okay. How did Knoedler deal with provenance in the early days in cases where chain of custody was less clear?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's clear that they saw the London house as a real partner in this work. So because a lot of the paintings had passed through London that they dealt with, but, you know, Christie's and Sotheby's, and London was a real center of the art market. So they always asked the London house to send them the latest publications, and the London house would go through old country house guides. I mean, they had built up a huge library in London to be able to do provenance research.
Mhm.
And some of those papers still exist in London, and I've looked at, and they continued to, I mean, they hired librarians. That's what they called them. They were basically provenance researchers, but they were librarians because they had to acquire all these old books to be sleuths, basically. So there was a librarian in New York and a librarian in London, and they wrote to each other constantly. So yeah, so they, you know, it was good old, you know, sort of legwork, archival work, book work.
Great, thank you. I don't see any more questions. Does anyone else have a question before? Jim does.
I can't raise my hand, but I just wondered, Anne, if you have any information, because I know Duveen had this army of spies and scouts that he paid, who would comb through all the old country houses and see, they would hear the rumor that Lord so-and-so was in financial trouble and he might be selling. Did Knoedler do anything in a similar vein?
Yeah, yes and no. So they definitely kept their ears and eyes open. Again, we can see that in the correspondence to the London, in the London house. But to be quite honest, I think sometimes Duveen exaggerates their spy network, because it wasn't as hard as they make it out to be. Because beginning in the end of the 19th century, the Royal Academy, which was the leading art school in London, they always had an annual exhibition of contemporary art. But in the 1890s, they start to have an annual exhibition of old masters that they source from country houses. And those copies of those are in Knoedler's library. And you can see them writing in pencil alongside, "We'll follow up, go visit." So, I mean, that's what made, you know, here's this exhibition in London. It's on from, you know, they were in the winter. So it was, you know, you could go there over the holiday season, you know, and you would see all these great works brought together. They would have the owners' names next to them in the catalog. So the legwork, you know, and we know Duveen is shopping, you know, literally shopping from there as well. So, you know, that's why I think sometimes, I mean, yes, they were definitely sleuthing and following up and things. But, you know, sometimes London brought the work to them right to their front doors.
Thank you. That's great. I can't thank you enough. I mean, this is an interesting topic, and you've made it come alive for us, which I think takes an incredible amount of skill. So thank you very much. And I just want to turn this over to Bea.
Unmute myself. There we go. I finally learned how to unmute. Yes. Thank you, Anne. Well, you know, it just, you know, it brought up a lot for me, probably many of you all in the audience, about being in the library at the University of Cualquier and going through hours and hours of books and old paper, and just to get some basic stuff. And this is just going to make the whole field of art history, it's going to open it up, don't you think? Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that's a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but we're adding material to the Getty Provenance Index all the time. You know, we'll never have everything that ever happened in there, but one of the things we realized as a gap is we had no auction sales from the US in the Getty Provenance Index. So, but because when we acquired the Knoedler Archive, we acquired their library as well, including the catalogs of auctions they went to, where they wrote down in the auction catalog who bought what for what price as part of their keeping their eye on the market. So we are slowly digitizing those, and then we will add them to the Getty Provenance Index. So we really, here we are researching the American art market, but we didn't have the American art market in the Getty Provenance Index. So we're slowly making progress on that. So I tell people, do a search one year, do it again the next year. It might be different as we add more and more information.
Yeah, it's just amazing to me. Jim is smiling from ear to ear, I'm sure.
Well, and we have an amazing team, the team for the project for the history of collecting in provenance. So I have to give just full kudos to them, because they are the most patient and thoughtful and hardworking team to make sure we get everything right.
Yeah, no,
I
really.
think I'd like to mention, if I could, I think Agnes worked for our museum for a while. I don't know if she's mentioned that to you, Anne, but
Yeah, exactly. She's from
she did a lot of
St.
provenance work for us. Yeah.
Yeah, she's
See?
terrific. Just
Look at
terrific.
all these connections, really. Fascinating.
Well, I think when we proposed this lecture, I had dreamed of a weekend in San Diego, visiting your collections and things. So I'll have to postpone it. But I'm just so thrilled that we figured out how to do this, right? We are not giving up. We're keeping going on. So I'm delighted we could do this.
Thank you for ending with that message, because we are just keeping on, which is, and when you do come, let us know. We will wine and dine you. It will be a pleasure. And oh yeah, it would be fabulous to see you in person. Thank you.
Thank you
Again. And if you'll just hang on at the end, we'll all talk. And I want to thank all of you for being here for this lecture. And please remember to join us for our traditional third Friday, which will be June 18th, when, boom, everything seems to open up. It'll be our next lecture with the artist Marianela de la Hoz, and she will be discussing the work that she has on display here at SDMA, entitled Paintings from the Confinement, but her journey as an artist also. And so we hope that you join us for that. Please stay safe, stay positive, and stay well, and we'll see you in June. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you all for coming.